The day began with the slow hum of a city that never really slept, and within its restless veins moved countless stories of people who were seen and unseen. But among them was one story that carried a quiet power. Though it belonged to a woman, the world refused to notice she was a cleaner. Her life, painted in shades of struggle and silence. Her mornings, beginning before the sun stretched its light across the sky, her body rising though it longed to rest, her hands cracked and blistered from chemicals that had eaten away at her skin and her spirit, carrying the unspoken weight of survival. She was a black woman living at the edge of poverty in a small apartment whose peeling paint told tales of years of neglect and broken promises. The window let in wind during winter and heat during summer. The floor creaked with every step. Yet it was the only space she could afford, and within those walls she clung to fragments of hope that one day life would shift even slightly in her favor. But until then she carried herself with dignity, because dignity was the one thing she could still claim, even when the world stripped her of everything else. Her mornings began with quiet rituals, tying her hair, pulling on the faded uniform that carried the smell of bleach and floor polish, lacing shoes that had worn soles but still served their purpose, and carrying a heart heavy with worry, yet steady with resolve. She walked to work through streets that sparkled with wealth that never belonged to her, passing by shops whose windows displayed clothes she could never wear, jewelry she could never touch, and perfumes she could never afford. Yet she looked ahead with steady eyes, never pausing too long to mourn what was beyond her reach, because survival did not leave space for longing. Her job was simple to others, but for her, it was the endless cycle of cleaning offices that belonged to powerful men and women, wiping down tables where deals worth millions were made, vacuuming carpets where polished shoes carried the weight of ambition, and mopping floors where hurried footsteps never slowed to notice her presence. Her work was invisible, her labor unnoticed, her name rarely remembered, and yet she did it all with a quiet grace, because she had been taught by a mother who gave everything that the value of a person was not in applause or recognition, but in their ability to keep going, to give their best, even when no one was watching. And so she kept going every day, rising before dawn, working until her body ached, returning home with little to show for her sacrifice, but enough to survive another day, and in that survival, she found a kind of courage that the world often overlooked. It was on one of these mornings that her life shifted in ways she could not have predicted. She had only a few dollars in her wallet, barely enough for rent, barely enough for food. And yet after walking for nearly an hour, she allowed herself the smallest luxury, stepping into a cafe whose air was thick with the smell of roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries. She stood in line behind businessmen in sharp suits, behind women with phones pressed to their ears, behind teenagers laughing over trivial things that seemed like luxuries to her, and when her turn came, she ordered the cheapest coffee, the one she could afford, sipping it slowly, as though stretching time itself, because she knew it would be the only moment of calm before a long day of scrubbing floors and chasing the shadows of others' successes. As she sat there quietly, her eyes caught movement at the counter. A man stood there, tall but dressed simply, his clothes ordinary, his demeanor quiet. And when he reached for his wallet and handed his card, it was declined. Once, then declined again. The barista's patience thinned. People in line whispered and shifted. The man searched his pockets but found nothing, and in that small moment, she saw something in his face that mirrored her own countless moments of helplessness. She felt the sting of embarrassment, the ache of being looked at with disdain, and her instinct moved faster than her reason. Before she could remind herself of the few dollars left in her wallet, she stepped forward, placed them on the counter, and said softly that she would cover it. The barista nodded, took the money, and handed the coffee to the man. He turned to her, his eyes wide as though unaccustomed to kindness. With nothing asked in return, she offered him only a small smile before returning to her seat sipping her own coffee, as though the act was ordinary, though it was anything but to him. For she did not know that the man whose coffee she had just paid for was not a stranger, down on his luck, not a drifter without means, but a billionaire CEO who sat at the helm of one of the most powerful companies in the world, a man who had built empires and commanded rooms. Yet in that moment, he had been stripped of all the armor that wealth provided, and it was her small act of kindness that touched him in a way that billions never could. The cafe seemed louder in that moment, though no one else truly noticed what had just taken place for her. It was an ordinary gesture, an impulse born from a life where giving was not a luxury, but a duty, for she had grown up in scarcity, where neighbors borrowed sugar from one another, and mothers shared bread across households where no one had enough, but everyone tried to make sure no one went hungry. Her mother had taught her that kindness was the only currency that never lost its value, and so even when her own wallet held only a few wrinkled notes and coins, she still found herself giving. She gave not because she had much, but because she knew too well what it meant to have nothing, and in that understanding she could not ignore another person's quiet shame. She stirred her coffee slowly, her hands still trembling. Not because she regretted the money spent, but because she knew it meant something would be cut from her already thin budget. Perhaps she would eat less for dinner? Perhaps. She would stretch the last loaf of bread across more days. Perhaps she would go without milk this week, yet she did not dwell on it. Instead, she focused on finishing her coffee before it grew cold, for the warmth in her hands was the one comfort she allowed herself before returning to a world that demanded more from her than it ever gave back. The man sat across the room watching her, though she did not notice. He studied her face, the lines etched by years of fatigue, the softness in her eyes despite the hardness of her life, the strength in the way she held herself even as the world pressed down on her. He was a man who lived in excess, whose days were measured in contracts and profits, whose nights were spent in mansions so large they echoed with emptiness. Yet in all his wealth, he had never encountered a moment that felt as genuine as this, and he found himself wondering what kind of life produced such quiet generosity. He thought back to his own beginnings, a childhood, of modest means not as poor as hers, but not far from struggle. Either, he remembered days when his own mother worked 2 jobs just to put food on the table. He remembered nights when he pretended to sleep, so she would not see him listening to her, cries in the kitchen over unpaid bills, and he remembered the promise he had made to himself that he would escape that life at any cost. He had kept that promise, rising through determination, cunning, and relentless work, until he owned more than he ever dreamed yet. Somewhere along the way, he had lost the tenderness of those early lessons. Money had insulated him from reality. People treated him as though he were more than human and less than human. At the same time, an object of awe, an object of greed, a figure never approached without hidden motive. And he had forgotten what it felt like to be offered something without calculation. Until this morning, he sipped his coffee, slowly, tasting in it. Something beyond the beans, beyond the sugar, beyond the cream. He tasted humanity, raw and unpolished. He watched as she finished hers, tucked her small wallet carefully back into her bag, and stood to leave the cafe. Her back straight, her pace unhurried, though her body carried exhaustion like an anchor. She left, without knowing that her life had already collided with destiny in ways she could not comprehend. Outside, the streets roared with traffic. Buses screeched against asphalt, horns pierced the air. Yet she walked calmly, weaving through the noise like someone long accustomed to chaos. She clutched her coat tighter against the wind, her mind already shifting to the long hours ahead, scrubbing offices that would shine briefly before being dulled again by careless hands and muddy shoes. She thought of the bills waiting at home, the landlord's impatient voice, the thin envelope of cash she had tucked in a drawer, and the way her heart raced each month when she counted and recounted it, hoping it would stretch far enough and, though the fear lingered like a shadow, she did not allow herself to crumble. For she had learned long ago that the world did not pause for brokenness. So she carried herself onward. Her steps steady, though her future felt uncertain. The man remained, inside for a moment longer, staring at the door she had walked through. His thoughts swirling heavier than the steam rising from his cup, and in that silence he began to form a decision. Though he did not yet fully understand it. He knew that the woman who had given him coffee when she had almost nothing had awakened something buried deep within him, and he could not let that moment pass into memory. He would not yet reveal who he was. He would not yet speak his truth, but he knew he would see her again, and when he did, the world as she knew it would begin to change forever. The walk from the cafe to her workplace was long but familiar. Each crack in the pavement, each broken streetlight, each corner where shadows pooled like secrets was etched into her memory. She had walked this path for years, and it had become an extension of her body. Yet today, there was an unfamiliar weight in her steps, not of regret, but of reflection. She thought of the man whose coffee she had paid for his face, stayed with her, though she did not know why. Perhaps it was the look in his eyes when he realized what she had done. A look that held surprise, disbelief, and something deeper, something like gratitude. It lingered in her mind because she rarely saw that look directed at her. Most people passed her by without truly seeing her at all. In offices, she was a blur of movement, a figure that existed to clean, to restore, to remove the traces of their busyness and ambition. Yet in that brief moment at the cafe, someone had truly looked at her as though she mattered. She shook, the thought away, focusing instead on the day ahead. The building she worked in loomed in the distance, glass and steel reflecting the sky like a mirror of power. Its lobby polished, its elevators gleaming, its offices filled with people whose names appeared in magazines, people whose lives were far removed from hers. She entered through the side door as always, her badge worn from years of swiping her shoes, squeaking against the floor, her presence unnoticed by the guards who barely glanced at her. And she made her way to the storage closet that doubled as her office, where shelves lined with cleaning supplies became her tools of survival. Gloves, mops, buckets, sprays. She tied her apron tighter, pulled on the gloves, and began her routine. The rhythm of labor that kept her world afloat, though it drowned her slowly. Each desk she wiped, each bin she emptied. Each floor she scrubbed was a piece of her exchanged for a paycheck that barely covered rent. Yet she did it with the same quiet strength she had always carried, because to her there was no other choice. While she worked, she thought about her life, the dreams she once had of studying, of becoming something more than invisible. Labor, those dreams had withered long ago, pressed down by responsibilities and the relentless hand of poverty. Yet she carried a different kind of dream, now smaller, but no less important. A dream that one day she might rest, that one day she might breathe without worry, that one day her sacrifices might not be in vain. Her coworkers passed by, some offered small smiles. Others ignored her entirely, and a few looked down on her as though her uniform defined her worth. But she paid no mind to them. Her mother had told her once that the measure of a person is not how the world treats them, but how they choose to respond, and so she responded with dignity, always never lowering herself to bitterness, though bitterness had every reason to claim her hours. Past, the building filled with voices, meetings, footsteps, elevators chiming, and through it all she remained in the background, a ghost of labor, a presence necessary yet unseen. At lunchtime, she sat alone in the storage room, unwrapping the simplest meal, bread and butter, a piece of fruit. When she could afford it, and a bottle of water she had refilled from the tap, she ate slowly, savoring every bite, because she knew it had to sustain her. Until evening, her body longed for more. But her reality allowed only this. She thought again. Of the morning, of the few dollars she had given away, of the coffee she had bought for a stranger. And though her stomach ached, she felt no regret, because her soul felt lighter. Kindness had always been her anchor when the world tried to pull her. Outside, the man she had helped remained closer than she realized. After leaving the cafe, he had followed at a distance, careful not to draw attention, his eyes fixed on her as though she were a mystery he needed to solve. He watched her enter. The building watched the way others overlooked her and felt an ache in his chest, a strange guilt that he had never before considered the people who labored in his empire to keep it shining. He had built his fortune on the backs of thousands, yet their faces blurred into a nameless mass, and for the first time he forced himself to truly see one of them, to watch her carry the weight of invisibility with quiet strength. He stayed for hours unseen among the crowds in the lobby, or sitting in a cafe across the street, his mind replaying her act again and again. He thought of the money in his accounts, of the endless luxuries at his disposal, and felt a hollowness that wealth could not fill. He realized how starved he had been for authenticity, how long he had lived surrounded by sycophants and opportunists, how rarely he encountered someone who acted without agenda, and he knew that he could not let this moment fade into memory. She had given him something priceless, not the coffee, but the reminder that kindness still existed, that humanity still breathed even in the harshest corners of the city as evening fell. She left the building, shoulders heavy but steps steady. And he followed again unseen, watching her cross streets lined, with flickering lights, watching her enter the worn-down building where she lived. He stood there for a long time, staring at the door behind which she disappeared, wondering about her world, wondering about the life she endured. And in that stillness, he made a silent vow. Her kindness would not go unanswered. Her sacrifice would not go unnoticed. He would find a way to repay her, not with pity, but with opportunity, not with charity, but with transformation. And though she did not yet know it, the day she bought a stranger's coffee would become the day her destiny began to shift. The man who had sat quietly in the cafe sipping coffee, bought for him by a woman who had little to spare, found himself unable to walk away from the weight of what had just happened, because though he was a billionaire, a CEO who commanded respect in boardrooms and shaped economies with his decisions in that moment, he was not thinking of profits or mergers or expansion. He was thinking only of the way her hands trembled slightly when she placed the money on the counter, the way her voice carried both humility and strength when she told the barista to put the coffee on her bill, the way she smiled softly afterward, not as if she had done something extraordinary, but as if it were the most natural thing in the world for her to help another person. And as he walked out into the city streets, the taste of that coffee lingered on his lips, not because of the beans or the sugar, but because of the sacrifice that had purchased it. He could not bring himself to return to his office. Not yet. Not when his heart felt pulled toward something raw and unpolished and real. So instead, he followed her, careful to remain unnoticed. His expensive shoes, now plain sneakers, his suit replaced with ordinary clothes. And for the first time in many years, he felt invisible in a way that freed him rather than trapped him. He watched her walk the long path toward the towering building. He knew well a building that stood like a monument to his success, its glass and steel cutting into the sky, its logo shining like a crown at the top. And as she entered through the side door, meant for workers, he felt a pang of guilt. For he had walked through the grand entrance countless times, never once wondering who scrubbed those floors, who polished those handles, who emptied those bins. And now he saw her disappearing into that world like a shadow, and realized she had always been there, unseen, carrying a piece of his empire on her back. He stood across the street for a long time, staring at the building as if seeing it for the first time, not as a symbol of victory, but as a reminder of those who remained invisible beneath its shine. Then finally he walked inside, blending in easily without his usual entourage. No one recognized him, without the armor of wealth and power. And he moved quietly through the corridors, searching for her, until at last he found her, bent over a bucket scrubbing the marble floor. Her movements efficient, yet heavy with exhaustion. Her shoulders tight. Her back curved, yet even in that posture there was an undeniable grace, the grace of someone who refused to collapse even when the world tried to break them. He lingered at the corner, unseen, his heart strangely restless as he watched her every motion, her hands moving rhythmically, her eyes focused, her silence speaking louder than words around her. People passed by without a glance. Some spoke to each other in hurried voices, some scrolled through their phones, some laughed carelessly, but none of them looked at her, not really looked at her. And in that moment he realized the true cruelty of invisibility. It was not loneliness. It was being surrounded by people who refused to see you. He clenched his jaw, feeling anger rise, not at them, but at himself, for he had built this empire and never stopped to ask how many unseen hands made it possible. He thought of the times he had stood on stages accepting awards, speaking of innovation and leadership, yet never once acknowledging the janitors, the cleaners, the cooks, the drivers, the ones who made it all possible. Silently, he made a vow that would soon grow into something larger. He would not let this woman remain invisible, not after what she had given him. He spent hours that day drifting through the building, watching her unseen, sometimes from a distance, sometimes close enough to hear the sound of her bucket rolling across the tiles. He noticed how she paused briefly to stretch her aching back, how she hummed softly under her breath to push away the monotony, how she moved quickly when a manager passed by, tightening her posture as though bracing herself for scolding. Though she had done nothing wrong, he noticed too how others treated her. Some ignored her as though she were furniture, some made small messes, deliberately knowing she would clean them, and a few offered polite nods without true acknowledgement. And through it all she remained steady, her dignity unshaken, her focus unwavering, and he felt his respect for her deepen with every passing hour. At lunchtime, he watched her retreat to a small storage room where she ate alone her meal. Nothing more than bread, a piece of fruit and water from a plastic bottle she had filled at the tap. He saw how carefully she unwrapped it, how slowly she ate, savoring each bite as though stretching the moment to last until evening. He imagined what her life must be like outside these walls. The narrow apartment, the unpaid bills, the sacrifices unspoken, and he felt something inside him shift. He thought of the lavish lunches he often attended with executives' plates of food that cost more than her weekly wage, wines imported from across oceans, desserts prepared by world-renowned chefs, and in that contrast he felt ashamed, not because he enjoyed luxury, but because he had forgotten the value of simplicity, the way a piece of bread eaten in solitude could still carry grace. He left the building in the afternoon, returning later to see her finish. Her shift, her steps slower now. Her body weighed down, but her eyes still steady. She left through the same side door, walked down the same cracked sidewalk, and he followed again, always at a distance, until she reached her building. A worn structure, with peeling paint and rusted railings, a building that leaned as though tired of holding itself upright. He watched her climb the stairs, disappear through a small door. And he stood there for a long time, the city lights flickering around him, his mind filled with questions about her life, about her dreams, about the strength that kept her moving forward day after day. He returned to his penthouse that night, a space so vast it echoed with silence. He stood by the window overlooking the glittering skyline of the city, a view most envied yet. For the first time it felt hollow. He poured himself a drink but left it untouched, sat in his leather chair but found no comfort. His thoughts remained with her, the cleaner who had bought him coffee with, the last of her money, and as he sat there he realized he had a choice. He could let the moment fade into memory as a strange story to recall someday, or he could let it become the beginning of something greater. He could step into her life not as a savior, but as someone who finally saw her, someone who finally recognized the humanity the world had overlooked. He did not know yet how he would do it. He did not know yet what shape it would take, but he knew he would not let her kindness go unanswered, because in her small gesture she had given him more than he had received in years. She had given him back his faith in people, his belief that not everything was transactional, not everything was measured in profit and loss, and in that gift she had unknowingly awakened a part of him he thought was gone forever. That night, as the billionaire lay in the expanse of his penthouse surrounded by glass walls and marble floors, the silence pressed against him in ways he had never noticed before. The walls seemed to echo back the emptiness of his victories. The shelves lined with awards looked less like achievements and more like reminders of a race he had run, without ever knowing why he poured himself another drink. But the taste of luxury no longer held satisfaction. Instead, it tasted bitter, as though mocking the hollowness that lived inside him. He set the glass down untouched and walked across the wide living room, his footsteps echoing as though reminding him that he was alone. He thought of the cleaner again, the way she walked through life, unnoticed, the way her kindness had cost her something real, yet she gave it freely, and he compared it to the way people in his life treated him. Every smile, every handshake, every kind word often came with expectation, deals, partnerships, access, opportunities. Nothing was given freely to him anymore. Nothing had been given freely in years. And the realization cut deep, because though he sat at the top of the world, he was starved for something simple, something human, and that woman had given it without hesitation. He tried to focus on his upcoming meetings, the contracts waiting for his signature, the expansion plans across continents, but his mind kept drifting back to her, to the sound of her voice when she told the barista she would pay, to the way she sat sipping her own coffee quietly as though her act was nothing remarkable, when in truth it was extraordinary. He walked into his study, a space filled with books, leather chairs, and a massive desk carved from imported wood. But even here, among symbols of success, he felt no peace. He sat down, but instead of looking at reports or numbers, he began scribbling thoughts in a notebook, something he had not done in years. He wrote about her. He wrote about kindness, about invisibility, about the weight of labor that went unseen. He wrote until the words blurred on the page, because for the first time in a long while, he was not writing about profits, but about people, about humanity, and about the responsibility that came with his wealth. When dawn finally broke, spilling golden light across the skyline, he felt restless. He could not simply return to business as usual. Not after what had stirred inside him. He dressed again. Not in the sharp-tailored suits that marked his identity, but in the same plain clothes he had worn the day before. He needed to see her again, not to reveal himself yet, but to understand her world more deeply. So he left his penthouse, climbed into an ordinary car instead of his chauffeur-driven one, and drove back toward the old building where she lived. He arrived early enough to see her step out the door, her uniform neat. Despite its wear, her hair tied back, her shoes scuffed, but steady. She carried herself with a quiet purpose, though her face carried lines of fatigue. She walked with her head held high, as though reminding the world that though it overlooked her, it would not break her. He followed again at a distance, watching her weave through the streets until she reached the cafe. Once more, she ordered the same cheap coffee, sipping it slowly, her eyes staring out the window as though lost in thought. He wondered what she dreamed about in those moments, if she allowed herself to dream at all, or if the weight of her circumstances kept her dreams locked away. He felt a pang of guilt again, knowing he had the power to change her life with a single decision. Yet he also knew he could not simply walk up to her and hand her money. It would insult her dignity. It would reduce her gift to a transaction. And she deserved more than that. She deserved opportunity. She deserved recognition. She deserved a chance to stand in the light, rather than remain invisible in the shadows. He spent that entire day trailing her again, watching. As she worked, watching as she endured, and by the time evening came, his decision had grown firmer. He would not let another day pass without preparing something for her. Not an act of pity, but a gesture that would honor the strength she carried. Within, he returned to his penthouse. That night filled with a restless energy. He began to make calls to people he trusted. The few who were not blinded by greed, he asked about programs within his company. Scholarships, support systems, initiatives he had once approved on paper but never truly involved himself in. He asked about ways to elevate the unseen workers, the janitors, the cleaners, the ones whose lives barely brushed the surface of his empire, and as he listened to their answers, he realized how disconnected he had been for years and how much work needed to be done. But for the first time, he felt determined not just to add her name to a faceless list of beneficiaries, but to build something lasting, something that would ripple. Beyond her life alone, he knew it would take time, but he also knew he was willing to commit to it, because her small act had planted a seed in him, a seed he could not ignore. And as he finally sat back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him, he whispered to himself that she would never remain unseen again, not if he had anything to do with it. The following days unfolded like chapters in a book he could not stop reading, because each morning he found himself drawn back to the same streets, the same cafe, the same building where she labored unseen, and each evening he returned to his penthouse, carrying with him not the satisfaction of corporate victories, but the weight of her resilience that had begun to transform his understanding of the world. He had built his empire on ambition and discipline, telling himself always that his relentless drive was for progress, for innovation, for the betterment of society. Yet when he looked at her bent over a mop, her hands raw, her meals meager, he realized that his progress had left countless behind, that his betterment had been selective benefiting. Those already standing in the light, while those in the shadows like her continued to toil without recognition. He remembered the day when he himself had nothing, the hunger, the longing, the desperate hope for a chance. And though his story had ended, in triumph hers remained locked in struggle, not because she lacked strength or determination, but because the world was designed to overlook her. And as he watched her day after day, he began to ask himself questions he had avoided for years. What was the point of wealth if it did not lift others? What was the point of leadership if it did not see the unseen? What was the point of success if it could not create more than luxury for a few and silence for many? The questions pressed into him, heavier each day until he knew he could no longer remain still. He had to act. Yet he also knew he had to tread carefully because she was not someone who wanted pity. She was not someone who wanted charity. She was someone who valued dignity above all else, and if he approached her in the wrong way, his intentions, no matter how pure, would insult her strength and diminish the very kindness that had awakened him. So he devised a plan not in haste, but with deliberate care. He began by gathering information not through invasive means, but by quietly asking those within his company who oversaw staff rosters and contracts. He discovered her name, her years of service, the meager wages she earned, and the spotless record she maintained. He read notes written by supervisors praising her work ethic, though rarely noticing her humanity. He saw the numbers that quantified her labor and realized how grotesquely small they were compared to the billions he controlled. And he felt ashamed that his company thrived while she barely survived, ashamed that he had signed off on budgets that allocated millions to events and bonuses, but pennies to the cleaners who made those spaces shine. He spent nights drafting outlines of a program. He would create one that would provide education, healthcare, housing support, not just for her, but for all workers like her. A foundation that would exist within his empire, yet serve those the empire had forgotten. But even as he envisioned this larger mission, his thoughts always returned to her because she was not just a symbol. She was a person with a life, a story, and he wanted to know it in its fullness. So he began to follow more closely, not to invade but to witness. He watched as she stopped at small grocery stores buying only what she needed. Never indulging in more than her budget allowed, he watched as she carried bags up the broken stairs of her building, her back straining but her pace steady. He saw the way neighbors greeted her, some warmly, others indifferently, but all acknowledging her presence unlike the world inside the offices where she vanished into invisibility. He noticed how she sometimes paused at the window of a bookstore, her eyes lingering on novels she could not afford, how she sometimes passed a park and slowed briefly to watch children play, a softness entering her gaze as though remembering a childhood that had been stolen too soon. He watched her return home each night to the same dimly lit apartment. Her curtains thin, her walls cracked, yet she kept it neat, clean, and filled with small touches that revealed her pride. A flower in a glass jar, a blanket folded carefully, a chair placed by the window as though it were a throne, she claimed, against the poverty that tried to strip her dignity. And the more he observed, the more he admired her, not just for her kindness, but for her strength, for her ability to create beauty, even in scarcity, for her refusal to surrender to bitterness, despite every reason to do so. He began to imagine conversations with her, what he would say, how he would reveal himself, how he would thank her. But each time he stopped himself because the words felt inadequate. Nothing he could say would truly capture the depth of what she had given him, so he decided instead to act to build the stage before speaking. The next week, he instructed a small team within his company to begin developing a new initiative. He told them it was to support unseen workers, to provide scholarships to their children, health care for their families, training programs that could elevate them into better roles. He told them it was to be implemented quietly, without fanfare, until the structure was ready, and when his team asked why the sudden interest, he simply replied that it was overdue. Meanwhile, he continued to follow her life in silence. One evening, he saw her sitting on the steps outside her building, her shoulders slumped, her hands folded as though she were carrying the weight of a world unseen. And he longed to walk up to her, to sit beside her, to tell her that she mattered, that she was seen, that her kindness had reached further than she could imagine. But he held back, knowing the time was not yet right. He returned home that night, restless again, his penthouse colder than usual, the skyline outside his window more hollow than beautiful. He lay awake thinking of her until sleep finally claimed him, and even then she remained in his dreams, dreamed of her walking into rooms filled with light, her shoulders free of burden, her smile unbroken, her eyes shining with recognition. He dreamed of her standing tall, not as a cleaner but as a woman acknowledged, respected, celebrated, and when he woke, he knew that his dream would not remain a dream. He would make it real, not just for her, but for all those like her. But she would be the beginning, the spark, the reminder that one small act of kindness could change the course of lives, including his own. Days turned into weeks, and his quiet observations became a rhythm, almost like a ritual that gave his life more meaning than any board meeting ever had. He found himself thinking less about profit margins and stock performance, and more about the rhythm of her steps, the way she carried her world on weary shoulders, yet still managed to stand upright, the way her hands, though tired, never trembled when she worked, as if her dignity was woven into every sweep of her broom, every scrub of her cloth. And each day he thought about how she had unknowingly rescued him, not from poverty, but from emptiness. He had lived in abundance, yet without purpose. His days a blur of deals and expansions, but now each moment carried weight because he had seen her, because she had reminded him of something fundamental, something he had forgotten in his ascent to power. He began to recall his own mother, who too had once worked cleaning houses to keep him fed. He remembered how invisible she had felt, how neighbors often ignored her, how sometimes she cried when she thought no one could hear, and as he remembered those nights, the memory of the cleaner overlapped with his mother, and he felt a tear escape his eye. He had not cried in years, but Now tears seemed to come easily, and each one carried with it a clarity he had long buried. The clarity that wealth was never meant to be hoarded, that leadership was never meant to be detached, that humanity was never meant to be overlooked. One morning, as he watched her again at the cafe, he noticed her pause before paying for her own small cup. She checked her wallet fingers, carefully counting the bills before placing them down, and he saw the hesitation in her eyes, the calculation of whether this small luxury could be afforded today, and he felt his chest tighten because to him, money was an ocean endless and vast, but to her it was drops that had to be measured and rationed, and he thought of how unfair the world was and how responsible he was for at least a part of that unfairness. He wanted desperately to walk in then and tell her to never worry about money again, but he restrained himself. He reminded himself that dignity mattered more than relief and that timing mattered more than haste. So he left quietly, though his mind burned with resolve that soon her hesitation over a cup of coffee would be a memory never repeated. He began writing letters to himself every night, letters he imagined giving to her someday, not of apology, but of gratitude. He wrote about the way she had opened his eyes, about the way she had given him something that money could not buy. He wrote about how she had reminded him that humanity was not found in boardrooms, but in the quiet corners of cafes, in the small sacrifices of those who had little to give. And though he knew he might never hand her those letters, writing them anchored him. It gave him a sense of direction, each word sharpening his resolve to act when the time was right. One evening, his company hosted a gala, a glittering event filled with the wealthy and the powerful chandeliers, casting golden light over laughter and champagne glasses clinking. And yet as he stood among them, he felt nothing but distance. He looked around at the tailored suits, the designer gowns, the practiced smiles, and all he could think about was the cleaner sitting somewhere in her dim apartment counting pennies to stretch until the end of the week. He excused himself early, leaving behind puzzled colleagues, and returned to the quiet of his study. There he opened the files he had been preparing, drafts of the new initiative, blueprints of scholarships, housing projects, medical benefits. He expanded them. He doubled their scope. He poured into them the same intensity he once reserved for acquisitions and mergers. And as he worked, he imagined her face. He imagined telling her that her kindness had not been wasted, that it had created a movement that would change countless lives, and he felt more alive than he ever had in years. But still he hesitated to reveal himself, because he knew that approaching her without thought could shatter everything. So he decided to create opportunities around her first subtle changes that would ease her burdens without exposing his hand. The next week, when she arrived at one of the office buildings she cleaned, she found new supplies waiting for her, supplies of better quality that would make her work easier. She looked puzzled, but carried on, unaware that he had ordered them himself. Another time, the building manager casually mentioned that hours had been adjusted slightly so she could leave earlier in the evening, giving her more rest. She looked surprised but grateful, again, not knowing that the instruction had come from the very top. Each small act made him want to do more, but he remained patient because he wanted the final moment, the truth of who he was, to be revealed not as a display of power but as a testimony to what her kindness had inspired in him. He knew that moment was coming. Soon he could feel it building like a tide, and he prepared himself for it, rehearsing in his mind how he would tell her not to shock her, not to overwhelm her, but to thank her, to honor her, to promise her that from the day she bought him coffee, when his card had failed, her life would never remain the same. He would ensure it, and through her countless others would rise too. The day he had been waiting for finally began like any other, the city waking under a gray sky, the streets alive with hurried footsteps, the cafe filled with the low hum of voices and the scent of roasted beans. And yet for him it was not an ordinary morning, because he had made a decision last night. After weeks of hesitation and months of silent observation, he would finally step out of the shadows. He would no longer remain, just the stranger, whose card had once declined. He would no longer watch from a distance. He would reveal who he truly was and why her act of kindness had changed him forever. He dressed simply, leaving behind his tailored suits and luxury watches, choosing instead a plain shirt and worn shoes, because he did not want to arrive as a billionaire. He wanted to arrive as a man humbled by her humanity. He carried with him a small envelope, not heavy, not extravagant, but filled with papers that represented the beginning of a new life for her: contracts of housing ownership, educational scholarships for her children. If she had any healthcare benefits secured for years, letters of employment that would elevate her role far beyond cleaning, because he wanted her to know she deserved more than survival. She deserved stability, dignity, and recognition. As he entered the cafe, he saw her already there, wiping tables, moving chairs with the same quiet rhythm she always had, her expression calm, yet carrying the invisible weight he had come to recognize. Her uniform neat, though faded, her shoes scuffed, yet carrying her steadily across the floor. He paused for a moment, just watching her, his chest tightening with admiration and fear, because though he had faced rooms filled with powerful men, though he had spoken to presidents and negotiated with kings, he had never felt as nervous as he did now about speaking to her. He took a slow breath and approached. She looked up briefly, nodded politely, and continued her task to her. He was still just another customer. She did not know that the man standing before her was someone the world called a titan of industry, someone magazines placed on their covers, someone whose name was whispered in markets across continents. She did not know that the man she had once helped was worth billions. She only saw him as she always had: a stranger among strangers. He ordered a coffee, his voice steady though his heart raced, and as she handed it to him, their eyes met briefly, and he felt the urge to speak, but the words caught in his throat. So instead he sat down, clutching the envelope, his mind rehearsing again and again. How to begin? Should he thank her directly? Should he reveal his identity first? Should he hand her the papers, or speak from his heart? He realized no plan would ever feel perfect, so he decided to let honesty guide him when she finished her tasks, and finally sat at a corner table sipping water. He rose and walked over. She looked up, surprised but not unkind, and he asked softly if he could sit. She nodded. Curious, he placed the envelope on the table between them, his hands trembling slightly, and for a moment he simply looked at her, memorizing her face, the lines of strength, the quiet dignity. Then he spoke, his voice low, but filled with sincerity. "Do you remember me?" he asked. She tilted her head, uncertain. Perhaps she thought he was mistaken. So he continued, "Months ago. My card declined, and you paid for my coffee without knowing me, without asking for anything in return. You simply smiled and said, 'It happens,' and you gave me dignity when I had none." In that moment, her eyes widened. Recognition dawning slowly, she remembered the stranger, the awkward moment, the simple gesture she had dismissed as small and unimportant. And she nodded. "Yes, I remember," she said, her tone casual, as though it had been nothing but. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. "For me, it was everything he said that day changed my life." She frowned, puzzled, not understanding, and he knew the moment had come. He took a deep breath and revealed the truth. "I am not just a man whose card failed that day. I am the CEO of one of the largest companies in this city. I am a billionaire," and her eyes widened, further disbelief flickering across her face. She almost laughed, thinking it a joke, but his steady gaze told her it was not. He continued, "I did not tell you then because I did not want to overwhelm you. I wanted to understand you, to see you, to honor what you gave me with your kindness, and I have watched not to invade, but to witness the strength with which you live, the dignity with which you work, the beauty you create, even in hardship, and I realized that all my wealth, all my power meant nothing if it did not serve people like you. She sat frozen, unsure how to respond, torn between shock and suspicion. Yet something in his voice, something raw and unpolished, told her he was not lying. He slid the envelope toward her and said, "Inside is the beginning of what I want to give, not as charity, but as gratitude, housing, health care opportunities, a chance for you to rest, a chance for you to dream, a chance for you to live. Not just survive." Her hands hesitated before touching the envelope, her eyes filling with tears. She shook her head, slightly whispering, "I don't understand why me." He leaned closer, his voice breaking. "Because you saved me." He said, "Not with money, not with power, but with kindness. In a moment when I felt invisible, you saw me and gave me dignity, and I cannot let that gift go unanswered." She covered her mouth, her shoulders trembling as emotions flooded through her disbelief. Gratitude, fear, pride. She whispered again, "I don't want pity. I don't want to feel like I owe anyone." And he shook his head firmly. "This is not pity. This is honor. This is me recognizing you for who you are, someone stronger than anyone. I have met someone whose kindness has reminded me of my humanity. You owe me nothing. It is I who owe you everything." Silence hung between them, heavy yet sacred. The cafe around them fading into background noise, just two people, a cleaner and a billionaire, bound by a cup of coffee and an act of grace. And in that silence, she finally opened the envelope, her hands trembling as she read her, eyes scanning words that felt surreal, keys to a home scholarships, to education medical coverage beyond her dreams. She looked up at him, tears streaming, and for the first time in years, her smile was unrestrained, unguarded, radiant. He felt his own tears fall, and neither looked away, because in that moment, wealth and poverty, titles and uniforms fell away, and only humanity remained. Her hands clutched the papers as though they might dissolve if she let them go. Her breath shaky, her mind racing with disbelief, yet her heart whispering that this was real. She stared at him across the small table, seeing not the billionaire the world admired, but a man stripped of his armor, speaking with a sincerity that no wealth could fabricate. She whispered again, "Why me?" And though the words were the same, the meaning had shifted. It was no longer a question of doubt, but of wonder, of awe. And he leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, his voice carrying the weight of a vow. "Because you reminded me of something I had lost." He said, "I was drowning in success, blind to the world around me, and you with nothing but kindness pulled me back to the surface. You gave me a reason to look beyond myself, to care again." She shook her head, tears falling freely, her chest aching with emotions she had long suppressed. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever told her that. Her small, unnoticed actions carried weight in a world that usually dismissed her existence as invisible. She thought of all the years she had bent her back, cleaning offices and toilets, walking home under flickering streetlights to an empty apartment. Her wages barely enough to keep hunger at bay. She thought of how people never saw her, how they passed by without a glance, or sometimes with disdain. And now here sat a man of unimaginable wealth, telling her that she had saved him not with power, not with influence, but with a gesture so small she had nearly forgotten it. She whispered, "I was just being kind." And he smiled softly, shaking his head. "You were being extraordinary in a world that forgets kindness. You remembered it in a moment when no one would have blamed you for turning away. You chose to give, and that choice has reshaped my life forever." She looked down at the envelope again, her fingers tracing the bold letters, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can accept this," and he replied firmly, "You can, because it is not a gift. It is recognition. It is a reflection of who you are, of what you deserve, and it is not just for you. It is for the world that will be touched by the opportunities this creates, because through you, I will build something greater than myself." She blinked, confused, and he continued, "I am starting a foundation inspired by you by that moment in this cafe. It will help cleaners, workers, mothers, fathers, anyone struggling unseen. It will lift them. The way you lifted me and your name will stand at the heart of it because this began with you." She gasped, her heart pounding, unable to fathom that her name, the name people ignored, the name people mocked for being ordinary, would now stand for something monumental. Her lips trembled as she tried to form words, but all that came were sobs, soft, broken sobs of release, years of silence spilling out at once. She buried her face in her hands, overwhelmed, and he reached across the table, gently resting, his hand near hers not touching unless she allowed. And after a moment, she let her fingers slip into his, a connection raw, unplanned, but filled with truth. The cafe noise faded as though the world itself bowed before this moment. Two souls from opposite ends of existence meeting in the center, she whispered. "I have nothing to give you." And he shook his head fiercely. "You already gave me everything you gave me back, my humanity," she cried harder, the weight of years finally breaking the chains. Around her chest, she thought of her mother long gone, who once told her that kindness always returns. She thought of nights. She prayed for relief, never imagining it would arrive in this form. She thought of herself not as a cleaner, not as invisible, but as someone seen, truly seen. And as she lifted her head, their eyes locked, and for the first time she believed it. She believed she mattered. He whispered, "You are not invisible. Not to me, not to the world, not anymore." And she smiled through her. Tears a fragile smile, but real luminous. And in that smile, he saw his redemption complete. She pushed the envelope back toward him, shaking her head softly, and said, "If I take this, it must mean something more. It cannot just be about me, it must be for others too." He felt pride surge through him, because even in the face of abundance, her heart reached beyond herself. He nodded. "Yes, it will be for others. For all those who need what you once needed, you will help guide it if you allow be its voice, be its soul." She froze at his words, stunned that he would ask her to lead something born from his empire, but he meant it, his eyes unwavering, and in that moment she understood he was not giving her pity, he was giving her power, and that realization made her tears turn into laughter, soft, broken laughter, at the absurdity of it all, at the beauty of it all. She covered her face, shaking her head. "I cannot believe this." And he leaned back, finally exhaling a breath he had been holding for months. "You do not need to believe it today," he said, "but one day you will believe that your kindness changed everything for both of us." Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. But the morning in that cafe remained etched in both their hearts like fire on stone. She had taken the envelope home that day, her hands trembling as she placed it on the small kitchen table of her one-room apartment. She had sat there staring at it for hours, afraid to open it again, afraid it might vanish like a dream. But when she did, the papers did not dissolve. They remained solid proof of a reality. She had never dared to imagine a home. Waiting for her keys, shining on the page like hope scholarships written with her name, opportunities promised with her dignity intact. She cried again. Then not tears of disbelief, but tears of release. And that night she slept differently. For the first time in years, she slept without fear of eviction, without the gnawing ache of hopelessness. She slept with the fragile warmth of possibility in her chest. And as the days moved forward, her life began to shift slowly. Then suddenly she moved into the new apartment, her feet echoing against floors that were hers, walls that belonged to her, not to some landlord who could throw her out with a snap. She touched every corner as if blessing it with gratitude. She hung her old photographs on clean walls. She placed flowers by the window, watching them bloom like her heart. For the first time, she felt rooted, like the earth itself had made space for her. She returned to work at the cafe for a while, still sweeping floors, still wiping tables. But now, with a quiet strength, knowing she was no longer trapped, she was choosing. And when she saw him again, the billionaire who had once been just a stranger, They spoke not as benefactor and receiver, but as partners, because true to his word, he had begun the foundation and he had asked her to stand beside him. She resisted at first, her mind telling her she was not worthy, that she was just a cleaner. What voice could she possibly lend to something so grand? But he looked at her with that same unwavering gaze and said, "You are the very reason it exists without you. There is no voice stronger, no heart purer." And she realized he meant it. And so she said yes, and together they built something extraordinary. The foundation grew rapidly. Fueled by his wealth and her wisdom, it reached into neighborhoods ignored for decades. It provided food for children who went to bed hungry. It offered scholarships to students who worked by day and studied by night. It gave shelter to women who had known only doors slammed in their faces. It gave dignity to workers who were told they were disposable, and through it all, her presence guided the mission. She did not sit in an office high above. She walked the streets. She spoke with the people. She listened to their pain because she knew it firsthand. She knew what it was to be unseen, to be dismissed. She made sure no one under the foundation ever felt that way again. Her face became known not as a maid, not as invisible, but as a symbol of compassion and resilience. Newspapers began to write about her, calling her the woman who changed kindness into a movement. Cameras followed her, but she never sought the spotlight. Instead, she always pointed back to that single day in the cafe, back to the moment a cup of coffee connected two strangers, back to the truth that small acts ignite great revolutions, and as her life blossomed, so did her heart. Once heavy with loneliness, it began to beat with connection. She found friends. She never imagined she found a voice she never thought she had. She stood on stages once reserved for leaders and spoke not with polish, but with truth, and every word cut through crowds because it came from the raw marrow of lived struggle. And beside her always stood him, the billionaire who had once been broken, who had been saved not by power, but by a cleaner's kindness. He no longer wore his wealth like armor. He no longer sought validation in numbers or accolades. Instead, he sought humanity. He stood beside her humbly, learning, growing, changing together. They became a force not of wealth, but of grace. Their friendship bewildered many people, whispered, wondered why a billionaire would tie his legacy to a cleaner. But those who had hearts understood. They saw that this was not about status, but about salvation. They saw that love, not romantic, but deeper, more profound, bound them. A love born of respect, of recognition, of truth. And in time, even governments took notice. Leaders invited her to speak. Movements grew under her name, but she never let the world forget. She reminded them always, "I was just a woman who cleaned floors and wiped tables. I was unseen, and I did what anyone should do. I offered kindness, and it came back, not as coins, not as applause, but as transformation for me, for him, for all of us." And her words left crowds in tears over and over again, because they knew she was not a figure of fantasy. She was real flesh and bone, sweat and tears. And her truth was undeniable. She had once been poor and invisible, but she had risen not because of charity, but because kindness had been honored and multiplied. And as the years rolled on, the cafe where it all began became a place of pilgrimage. People came to sit at the table where she once paid for a stranger's coffee, not knowing he was a billionaire, CEO. People touched the worn wood as if it carried magic, but she would smile and tell them there was no magic, only humanity, and yet in her eyes, there was magic. The magic of belief, the magic of hope, the magic of kindness, echoed louder than any empire. And one evening, many years later, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky gold, she sat on a bench beside him, the billionaire, her friend, her brother of spirit. Their hair now streaked with gray, their bodies slower, but their hearts strong. He looked at her and said quietly, "Do you ever regret it?" And she laughed softly, shaking her head. "Regret kindness? No, never. It was the best investment of my life." And he laughed too, nodding because he knew it was true. And in that moment, with the world still spinning, with lives still changing because of what they had built, they sat in peace, knowing that one simple act in a cafe had rewritten the story of their lives forever. And as night fell, stars rising above, they knew one truth would outlive them both. Kindness never dies. It multiplies. It transforms. It redeems. And so the story of the poor black cleaner who paid for a stranger's coffee, not knowing he was a billionaire CEO, became not just their story, but the world's a reminder whispered across generations that no act of kindness is ever wasted and no soul is ever truly invisible.